We're now live on YouTube. It is the November 19th, 2018 meeting of the Joint Foundation Bootstrap Committee. We currently have 16 panelists on the call, and we're going to dive right into our agenda. We have a handful of different things going on. The first thing that we have on the agenda is number 36. It's for a stage advancement. This is a document outlining the governance of how we'll be operating the Bootstrap Committee itself. This was moved to stage 1 last week. In stage 2, it would mean that the proposal is in a place where we have agreement about the general structure, and it just needs to get last minute approval if there's any board or financial or legal approval that needs to be done. And as such, I'm actually going to be requesting that we immediately move this to stage 3. It has some sign off. It's been open in various different forms for a little while. Does anyone have any thoughts or objections to moving this to stage 2 and subsequently adopting the governance.markdown file within stage 3? So I'll take that silence as approval across the group. So what I plan to do is to land this as a stage 2 proposal and then open another pull request, which moves it to stage 3 and copies the governance.markdown file over into the root directory, which is where it needs to be. Jory, did you have any particular thoughts about when proposals meet stage 3? Do we keep everything like the folder in there for documentation purposes, or how would you imagine we move forward when something has graduated through the whole process?
So I think it might be helpful to maybe make another folder within the proposals folder that's like adopted or completed or something of that sort. So it does today, it does indicate that it's moved on, but we have that kind of documentation for historical purposes. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Do you think it makes sense to call it adopted, or to just do a stage 3 folder and we can organize future proposals in those stage folders?
I honestly don't have a super strong opinion on that. Adopted might be a little bit more clear that those are ones that are
Yep.
accepted, but
that makes sense. I'll make a pull request, and then perhaps we can reach consensus that if that pull request has sign off, that we don't need to wait for the next meeting to land it.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, awesome. So that moves us into our next section, which is an update on progress. The first one that we had was first pass at a Bootstrap process, number 7. Adam, I believe this is yours. I'll let you take it.
Yep. So I've actually closed this PR in lieu of 2 new PRs, breaking out some of the content. This is PR number 40 for just updating the README of the main repo with some of the copy that I had in this initially. It kind of fleshes out the repo description and adds a definition of jargon we've been using. We keep that updated as we go. It's helpful for new people coming in or for folks who haven't been following us closely. There's also PR number 42, which is opened up against Tracy's PR number 41, I believe, which is her formalization of old PR number 6, which is also on the agenda for a little bit later. This adds the vision statement, mission statement, and values recommendations that were identified at the Vancouver Collaborators Summit earlier this year to the foundation recommendations document that she has PR'd through the stage proposal process, number 41. Yep, so that's the current status. And I believe that was all the content that was requested to be broken out. And we'll let those PRs go through their respective life cycles.
Has anyone had a chance to review that PR and have anything to add right now?
I reviewed the README PR. I think it's great. I really appreciate it, Adam. I think it looks good.
Awesome. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So let's, I guess, maybe give that another week and try to get all the content locked down. Aim to get it landed next week.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah, and PR number 42 went up like a half hour ago, so nobody will have had time to review that yet.
Okay, excellent. So the next one that we have on here is expectations for a foundation draft. This was number 6. I think it's since been moved to number 41. Tracy, this is your PR. Would you like to lead the discussion?
All right, trying to unmute. Apologies for that. We're referring to, is it the PR that I opened up yesterday, or was this from the earlier? Sorry.
I think you've closed the earlier one, and then it's just the one that you opened up yesterday that we need to discuss.
Oh, yeah. So, as of last week, we had talked about how we had this awesome new proposal process. So I was unfortunately not able to get to that until yesterday and posted that for review. And what that included was what we had already discussed. I folded in the feedback that we'd had quite a bit of discussion on in the former PR, as well as the expectations documents that both the TSC and COMCOM had drafted. So what we've got now in its present state, what I tried to pull in was 2 sections. So one is the actual expectations that would affect the bylaws. I'm still trying to tease that out to make sure that we don't have too many things that like wouldn't be required to be in the bylaws per se, versus expectations and requirements that we have as projects that we know are really vital to a healthy, sustainable foundation. So I've got that into 2 sections, so things may move around. I'm hoping to also just make sure we don't have anything redundant in there. I would love feedback from folks if we think that there's a better way to structure that. The reason that I wanted to keep the requirements in that don't need to go in the bylaws is that I want to make it clear that those things have been communicated to the board, both boards and everyone who's trying to build this, proposed foundation, even if it doesn't affect the bylaws. Because I think we were trying to tease that out quite a bit. Also, it doesn't mean that if something doesn't end up in this document that it isn't important. It's possible that we come up with that down the road, in hindsight. And of course, that's when we can pull request again.
Speaking of which, there's also PR number 42, just making a note of it. And this opened up a few minutes ago, like I mentioned. So don't worry if you haven't seen it yet, but it's PRing in the content from the Collaborator Summit, like I mentioned before. So I'm not sure if it necessarily lives exactly in this document, so we can discuss that on the PR itself, but it seemed to fit with the theme. I just tagged it on the end of the,
awesome.
Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And Tracy, just to confirm, is it okay to close number 6 now?
Number 6 was the former draft of this, correct?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, that would be great. I gave, intention to close it yesterday, but I wanted to give people time to object.
Awesome, thank you. Great, so I think we can move on to the next item, which is number 21. We have a 5-minute time box for it, although we may not need it, which is how often and when do we meet? So, we have done, we were meeting at this time at 2 o'clock for a while. Last week, we, Mike, you've got your hand up?
Oh, sorry, Miles. I had raised my hand. On the expectations document, I was just going through it for the first time. I don't think a lot of these show up in bylaws, and so I'm not sure, if it was intended to be bylaws requirements as the header, but, you can put it into policies or expectation documents, things like that, hiring documents, but a lot of this would not be sort of actually going in the bylaws. I just hope people understand, like, some of this stuff wouldn't look right there.
Right. Yeah. So, that was, so initially we had this like kept very slim to only things that would be in the bylaws. And even with a description, there seemed to be a desire for folks to still be able to communicate the requirements outside of bylaw changes. So if there's only a couple of things that in some way would be caught in the bylaws, that would be, we'll tease that out and have that.
Yeah,
it's why I didn't title it like bylaws requirements, because there are like a section of it is bylaw requirements and the rest is requirements.
Maybe I'm looking at an older version of this. Yeah, so how the 3 community seats are billed is, I think, one that, we do need to, I don't know if that's in here.
Yeah, so that's a good question. We have a separate issue, I believe, that's building to proposal right now.
Sorry, I didn't mean to mix issues.
Yeah, no, you're fine. That's it was flagged last week that we haven't been spending, right? No one's building up to a proposal yet. So I think Tierney had started, or Adam had started that issue, and there'll be conversation on it.
Okay.
Yes, there was 2 issues. Issue 37 and issue 38 were both, one for the CPC and one for the C3.
Yeah, I'll actually make note of that because you're right. That's one of the few things that would definitely need to be mentioned in some way in the bylaws, correct? If we carve that out.
Yeah, no, I just want to make sure we do sort of hard code those things in where, board seats, for example, is one we would normally have that conversation. I think Andy's on as well, and Russ is on, so and Steve, so we could take that offline with them, but I do think we want to make sure we know where the board seats are coming from.
Excellent. And we can dig into that very soon as we get into a following item that we'll have on that. Let's move back to the talking about time. Thanks, Mike, for bringing that up, though, because that will definitely help scope that issue in the next week. So discussing time. We're meeting at 2 o'clock Eastern time right now. And now we're alternating between 2 p.m. Eastern and 9 a.m. Eastern, with the hope of getting more people from EMEA and APAC on the call. We do have participation of about twice as many people right now today than we did on last week's meeting. But with that being said, there are participants that were on that call that are not able to make this call, and they had expressed that the time was the reason why they were able to come. So I think with that being said, back on issue 21, if you go and check it out, I'll just drop the link into the chat really quickly. James Snell had suggested filling out a spreadsheet with our availabilities, and I'll drop that one more time. And here so far we have had, about 7 people fill it out. The idea would be that we could use this list of availabilities to try to determine a time that's a little bit more scientific than what we're doing right now, which is mostly, the 2 times that we suggested. So we don't need to discuss this at length, but I was just curious if anyone had any thoughts around what we're currently doing, if there's any complaints with the timelines that we have, and if people would like to continue moving with the times that we have or to adjust.
I think we still need to figure out if there's people who can't come who want to. I guess it's if we had the call for like filling out the meeting time spreadsheet, we could maybe then say that whoever filled out the spreadsheet are the people who showed interest, and base it based on that. Right now, I'm just not sure if we don't have people who just can't make it, and therefore we don't know whether they're interested, but the times don't work.
Mm-hmm. Well, is there anyone on this call right now who can speak to the second time improving their ability to attend? Well, that is that is not a very reassuring amount of enthusiasm. I think we should kick it back to the issue on this. I think that the intention here is good, but if what we're doing is making a meeting time that people aren't attending, that's not good. So perhaps what we can do is run that other meeting time at 9 a.m. one more time next week and see who shows up and what the attendance is like. And if we have another kind of showing where the majority of people on that call are still willing to come to the 2 p.m. times, perhaps we could just move with that. Any other thoughts on that, or are people okay with this for right now?
I guess we should continue it in the issue. Like, we haven't covered the case for whether neither of those two meetings work for somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah, as long as we can cover that case, I think it's the times that we have now are reasonable.
Let's move on to the next issue. And the next issue that we have is heavy one. It's number 33, which is drafting initial governance for the foundation. And so if you take a look, I'm going to drop a doc in here. This is something that we were working on last time. And Mike, this was a doc that you started up. So do you want to maybe give context for those who haven't seen this this document yet?
Sorry, just coming off mute. This document was one that I sort of drifted out the skeleton for in order to put together some of the core fundamental aspects of what would go into the governance structure that we used to base the bylaws and charters and everything on. So my hope was to get some of the core elements of what was going in. And I think some of this overlaps with Tracy, a bit of the expectations document. So I rely on you maybe to help in terms of making sure we got everything here. But for the lawyers that we're going to ask to work on the transition, Russ, Andy, and Steve, and making sure that they have access to this and this answers some of the core structural elements of what we're setting up was the ideal.
Mike, would it maybe make sense for you to present the doc? I can present it as well if you'd prefer.
Yeah, so I think we started presenting it last time. Are we starting from over again, Miles, or did you want to just jump into the comments that were added?
I think that this doc has not necessarily been seen by everyone because not everyone on this call was around last week. So I think kind of starting from the beginning and going through it again might be useful.
Okay. I'll start with at 3, which is really around the structure. I think there were a few iterations of this previously. This is the one that I think, Miles, you had shared this around the time of when we made the public announcement and brought the public conversation out. And so what we have here been iterated a few times. I think there's some changes to the name, like cross-project council and cross-community council. But what we're trying to do is put together what are the structural elements of what the merged organization looks like. It's really essentially based off of the node.js entity and adding in the ability to host additional projects and then bringing in the JSF project was the plan. So, there's different things in terms of projects, the incubator, sandbox, and commons.js, and the node plus JSF board, merge board. The cross project council was intended to give everybody who's in the projects a place to go to collaborate on cross project issues and cross project opportunities. The cross project council is independent of the projects, and the projects would independently continue to work on their own release cycles and everything to do with the releases. Sorry, I'm dealing with a cold too. And then we have the incubator, which was a way for projects to get started into the foundation and as a way for them to come in, even if they aren't a fully baked and ready to go project. And then the sandbox was a place for projects that want to benefit, but don't intend to graduate in terms of, there's probably going to be smaller projects. And Miles, if I'm butchering this, let me know. And then the commons.js was, I think, in intention to put together some resources and opportunity for certain projects to be associated with the foundation, but not underneath of the foundation, in such a way that there could be cross collaboration and some benefit from that relationship of being linked together. And then the cross community council was essentially the idea, as I understood it, was the existing Node.js ComCom, but applied to the entire project ecosystem, and then allow anybody who wants to work on specific things for their projects to be worked on underneath of the cross community council. Is that a fair revisit of this, Miles, and others who've been on this?
It's fairly accurate to me.
The one clarification though I'd point out is that in talking to the community committee, it's my understanding now is it's not the community committee itself, but that like so the existing community committee for Node.js would stay with the Node.js project. This is a new group that maybe models and does some of the same thing, similar things at a larger scope, but it wouldn't necessarily be the moving one committee to be this new committee.
Yeah, and I'd like to echo that. Basically what Michael said.
So I guess a question that I could ask then, based on the structure that we're talking about here, where we have something like a cross-project council and a cross-community council, where like you have top-level projects and the representation of that top-level project in this chart is the TSC. How do we kind of rectify that for an organization like Node? Like, because I guess one thing that we'd be considering is we'd be kind of refactoring and revisiting the bylaws of both the ComCom and the TSC. How do you see that fitting within this structure, having both a TSC and a community committee? How does that play into the CPC versus the C3? And how does it play? Like, who gets to go to the CPC from the Node project, for example?
So
well, I guess
that's exactly why we created those issues, because we were asking that same question. That's why those, I believe, 37, 38 were created.
I mean, a straightforward answer would be the TSC is the group that decides who goes to the CPC, and the community committee is the one who decides who goes to the C3.
So are we then telling other top-level projects that they must have a community committee?
I think it would be up to every project to decide how their representatives are selected for those two groups.
Daniel, you have your hand up?
Sorry, just trying to navigate this. Sorry, I had a question about the sandbox and the common JS. I mean, one of the questions that speaking to some people in the community, they were concerned about where do little projects live that are ongoing, but are not like incubated projects, but are things that just, are kind of minimal effort, but need a place to live and are key utility functions like within the JavaScript or the Node ecosystem. And it's not clear to me that something called sandbox is really, maybe it's just the terminology, but to me, sandbox is somewhere where you play and come up with new ideas and test things out, rather than a place where as a kind of general, or is your intention that stuff like that lives in common JS area?
Yeah, so I think that was a term that got borrowed from the CNCF, because we have a thing we call sandbox, and it's for things that are just thoughts and could be good projects, and we brought them in or started them within the community, and they would then progress into the incubator and out into a graduated project. So that's where that term comes from. But you could choose any term you want there.
Yeah, my comment was along the same lines, that I'm not sure sandbox is the right name for that.
I frankly don't think I care for any of the names that we've really come up with, but I'm fine with them being placeholders for now, to be frank with everyone.
Well, what about the idea that was floated, I think by Sam, about something like domain areas, like networking and stuff like that, or is that kind of out the window?
For myself, and I'll take I'll take responsibility for putting together this diagram. I think it was more just about like framing of where things would be. So like if we ignore the names, I was imagining just different ways in which projects would want to participate in the foundation. top level projects, however you want to call it, are ones that are, graduated or adhering to a whole bunch of things and also participating in the overall governance of the foundation. Incubator phase would be for projects that are looking to make it to a top level project but aren't there yet. So it's, they're there to be mentored and grow to a position where they can be a top level project. Sandbox, or whatever we want to call it, would be for projects that have their IP in the foundation but aren't necessarily participating in the larger foundation governance, nor do they have an interest to. And, like libuv off the top of my head is an example of a project within the Node Foundation right now that I think would live within that model. And then the Commons.js would be like a way that we could offer some of the similar things that we'd offer to projects in the sandbox without requiring them to put their IP within the foundation itself. So, whoever was speaking earlier, I'm totally forgetting the name of who said it, but there's a lot of projects within the ecosystem that are very important, and it's important to maintain them or important to offer them support. It could be possible for projects that are within, that classification to get support from the foundation in a limited nature without having to join the foundation.
So is it possible that we could, one, if people feel like strongly enough about the names, start an issue for a name? That's a great use of an issue instead of a meeting. And then secondly, like for these, I think it's good to know the context of these. So I think breaking these out makes a lot of sense. Like just for documentation's sake, like are we like, my question with Mike and like, okay, fill this stuff in. Do we put this also in the presenter notes? Like, do we link out to issues that further define almost like, a table of contents of all of the questions? Because I feel like we keep having these conversations around like, what is this? What do we do? And we're, even if we do a good job of breaking this down atomically, like we do need to have all of these things documented in the long run. It's great without having like too many words on a slide. That would be helpful to like the encyclopedia of the foundation.
Yeah, I think Tracy, if I could respond to your, what do we do with this? I think it'd be great to, spin out issues in GitHub and go through, the sort of process of coming up with a proposal and bringing back the answers to this. This was mostly just me making things up and putting them down so we had a starting point for a conversation. But, a lot of this just needs to be, I think, worked through an agreement and proposal process. And so my intent was not to do anything more than put it all into one place in a slide deck like this so that we could then hand it to the lawyers who, instead of handing them 20 pull requests and having them try to figure out where everything ended up, this would just be more or less the aggregation point for the answers. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I actually fielded a kind of a version of this question via email from one of the JSF projects today, just sort of asking like, what is this, top level project really mean? Is my project going to remain a top level project? And I let them know that we were really evaluating the CNCF methodology as a place to start, and suggested that he and I collaborate on a proposal that is basically the boilerplate of the CNCF process, and submit that as a stage 0 proposal. I started that like maybe an hour before this meeting, and I'm happy to kind of continue that line of progression if that seems like it would be valuable. But this is also something I'd really love for the JS Foundation projects to have a lot of chances to weigh in on, because I think there's no doubt that Node is going to be a top level project, but there's still more questions within the JS Foundation projects about what that really means.
Yeah, I would love to help with that, Jory. I think that's, or I'd love to even like just see it once y'all work on it. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question that keeps coming up around like from Node, right? We're used to one project in a foundation. So the idea of agency or like it being taken away is really like the question that was just posed about, well, what happens to representation for the TSC and for ComCom of Node? And like my immediate response is like, well, you know, we don't, and or like how do, you know, compared to other projects, like how would that work out? Like do the other projects have to have a community committee then? And I think the answer is like we need to write this in a way that allows for continued agency of the individual projects so that they can choose their representation, right? Like,
Yep.
it would make sense for a ComCom person, you know, or the ComCom to choose who goes to the cross community council for Node. But I don't really care, you know, like as long as it is meaningful, how the other projects decide to send their, you know, meaningful and relevant, how they get to the
Yes.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree with putting together that. I had a similar thought of putting it together as using the CNCF one. And I'll volunteer again if you need any help, just let me know.
This is how we stage 3.
So with that being said, I guess we were talking before about the community representation on the top level committees. Does it make sense to go back to that conversation?
Oh, I thought we had gone there.
That was Tracy's point.
Oh.
Basically, it's up to the projects to be able to choose how they get their representation, and we need to codify that into the documents that discuss the structure that says, you know, it should be something like they can send a representative, but it doesn't necessarily dictate how they select that representative.
Yeah.
Mm.
I think similarly, currently at Node and Node.js, the TSC and ComCom are both top level. Would we expect that to continue for the project as it would be in the new structure? And would we allow like other projects to slot in a ComCom like structure?
Again, that's up to the project.
Would you clarify the question, Joe? I didn't follow the question for the notes. Do you mind restating that?
Sure. Just that currently Node.js, the TSC and ComCom are both top level committees within the project, and I'm wondering how that moves forward.
So at least my hope would be we don't dictate very strict governance structure for projects in the foundation. So we can make a recommendation that this has worked well for Node.js in the past, having a TSC and ComCom as separate entities. Here's their operating documents. If you'd like to adopt the same thing, go for it. But I think mandating that projects function in a certain way would not be beneficial in the long run.
Well,
Sure,
but
Tracy has their hand up.
Yeah, I had a question back to Michael, which was, because I have to think about this too, is like, when you say, like, do we remain a top level committee, you know, in the new foundation as ComCom or TSC, like, what does that mean? Because like a big part of the top level committees for the Node project, right, is to me specific to the Node, the management of the project just within Node. And then there's also a component that is outward reaching in terms of representation on the board. Now, under this new structure, the board representation as proposed would likely be something like from the cross community council. So that component is removed, right? Although I guess, sorry, we're still talking about the potential for Node or other top level projects to have a board member. But like, it sounds like that would sort of not be guaranteed for a top level committee at this point. And so in that way, so I do think that there is an idea that we do need to revisit around like, what do we want when we say we're a top level committee? Because the context does change a bit.
Yeah.
I do, again, I think this is something that we need to like issue out. I'm actually trying to think of like, does this get flushed out in the community, the representation issues, or is this a separate issue of like defining what a top level committee is in the new foundation?
I think it actually becomes part of the representation, because I was thinking about that. If I understand correctly, the actual structure of the project itself will be completely outside of what's in the bylaws or charters, or, you know, will the Node project have a charter approved by the board in any sense?
I guess that's a good question to Mike Dolan. Do individual projects in the CNCF have a charter from the board?
Yeah, individual projects do have a charter, so that does get approved. So yeah, I would envision a very similar construct here as well.
And what's typically in that charter? That's how they, yeah, what's in that charter? That's the question.
Basically like a constitution of how they govern their project, and most importantly, what the intellectual property policy is around contributions to that project.
Okay.
But, you know, it varies in terms of how complete or detailed some of them are. You know,
Yeah, but it's just so that we get
NCF is a little bit different because it's all underneath of the Linux Foundation. Here you're talking about a separate legal entity, and so you may have a little bit different of challenge not doing a charter per project. I'll defer to Steve or Andy if they want to comment on that, but I think it might be a little bit more challenging to do it in this entity structure. But Todd, or was somebody?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, couldn't we just have like a standard template that people use, and if they deviate from that, then we do an approval?
Yeah, that's fine.
It may be helpful for this group to also see some examples of project charters from the CNCF, just what type of content and we're looking at here.
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily thinking of just the CNCF in my response there, but let me pull up a template, and maybe that would be helpful for people to see.
Yeah.
Mike, would you like to take over on the screen sharing then?
Hang on. I'm just trying to figure out which one to use.
Within the CNCF, when projects graduate to a full project, top-level project status, they're required to have a governing.md file, which outlines how the project is structured and how the project has progression and who are the decision makers for each of the body. But there is not, as far as I have seen, a template for that yet, and each of the projects has pretty much set up what works for them. Now, where it would intersect with this foundation in an umbrella sort of manner would be around any of the board seats. So I think I heard somebody say that we're still talking about top-level projects potentially having a board seat, not just the cross-project council and the cross-community council. Is that correct?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in that case, we would need to have a much tighter definition of top-level project and understand what that means and what that's required as we go into things like bylaws.
So just for to surface context from last week's conversation that happened at the other time, had fewer attendance. There was someone had brought up the concept of a constellation project. This is the phrase that they used, which was kind of a project that would conceivably be large enough to warrant having representation on the board beyond through the representation through the CPC or C3. And we might want to think about drawing a distinction between projects that are large enough or mature enough to have representation on CPC or C3 and projects that are even larger that warrant representation on the board. That was something that was touched upon last time, but not really dove into.
The way that this got handled in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation was we have 2 developer board seats, which are designated as project representation across the whole of the CNCF, and they are elected across the entire maintainership of the CNCF. But because Kubernetes could outvote the entire rest of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, it was agreed that Kubernetes would put up one of the positions, and then the whole of the community would vote on the other seat. So that's another possible way to do it, because we do have a similar situation in the CNCF where one project is substantially larger than the other, to use the constellation idea.
How are the votes done when you say that, you know, Kubernetes could vote?
So the Kubernetes seat actually was chosen by the steering committee. And so that was just representation from the steering committee that was put onto the governing board. And that seat is Michelle Norali, who sits on the steering committee. And then other developers or maintainers from all of the projects were nominated. And then there was a Condorcet vote that was sent out to everyone who had a maintainer designation across all of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation projects. And then that person was elected. The second seat was elected from that role, or from that election.
One thing that I think is worth pointing out right now, kind of looking at this, I think we do need to question whether or not we need a separate CPC as well as C3. Depending on the project structures that we're having and the focus of those groups, I think one thing we definitely need to flesh out is like how those two top level groups are different. Because initially, I think when we were talking about the CPC was a group that was going to have representation from all of the technical projects, and then the C3 was going to be kind of a cross-organization community committee type thing. But if we're talking that, you know, both committees are kind of open to participation from elected people from any project, then unless they have like really, really clear differences, I'm not sure that it actually makes sense to have two different ones.
Yeah, I would object to that immediately because the concerns are very different. Just like at the project level, the work that you're focusing on and the concerns and the skills that you're bringing to the table are very different.
And I mean,
you need to define that.
Right, exactly. I do think we need to define that. That's work. It's not that I don't think that it's needed.
For context, like if you think about in the technical sense, so the CPC could be taking on things like infrastructure for projects that is shared. I know Node probably won't give up all of its infrastructure and like give it to the CPC, but I know that we could easily have shared infrastructure as like, cool, these projects need infrastructure, let's ask the CPC who can get it allocated to us. Whereas the C3 could perhaps help organize meetups or, you know, have people who are interested in the community side of the projects from each of the member projects participating at that level to make sure the community needs and the kind of people needs are heard at that level and have representation at that level.
Yeah, and the community may have certain sort of infrastructure like things like end user feedback or processes that we've sort of formalized that could be helpful for other projects as well.
I think what's just coming to my mind is that, you know, the challenge may be that we're looking at these groups as sort of voting representation groups where it may be that, you know, maybe there's one voting group that's needed, but there's another group, which is one or more groups who are actually doing things like working in different areas and have interests, but they don't necessarily need to be involved in, you know, selecting what new projects get added to the project or not, right? You know, so
was that ever a part of what the C3 was going to be doing? To my understanding, that was never a part of C3.
Well, but the CPC is, as I understand it from CMCF, is mostly focused with deciding which like reviewing project applications, helping projects through the process.
Yep,
at that level. And so what seems to be missing to me is the group. You know, if we think that we should have a more forward-thinking planning or you know, active group across the projects, that's not something that we have here, or we need to expand the scope of the groups to do that. And then I'm thinking once you do that, I start to wonder, like Miles said, is like, does the governance group need to have, like, do we need two governance groups, or can you have one and then these other groups be split up by areas of interest, if you know what I mean?
I was not able to follow that. Like that was
I think I pick up what you're putting down, Mike. Michael.
Right. It's kind of like I could see us. There's certain things that need to have like votes or decisions made, and it may be that we need to separate that from groups who are interested in doing things like community outreach or helping with infrastructure, and not make it mean that you have to be in one in one of the CPC or C3 to be able to do that kind of stuff.
I guess like to add on what you're saying, Michael, membership requirements. What are the requirements for being parts of these groups, and why do we have those requirements? So I can imagine something like CPC, we want those requirements where it's top level projects who are represented there, because they are the people who are going to be making the decisions about who the other top level projects are. Whereas if we have groups that are doing large community efforts, do we need the same kind of level? You have to be part of a top level project to participate in the C3, and you might, depending on the scope of work. But I think that needs to be clarified. Tierney, you have your hand up.
So I guess one thing I'd like to understand: are you talking about representation for the C3 as well? Are you talking about like the need for representation at the board level? Is that also part of this?
No, I'm not necessarily trying to delve into that specifically. It's almost like we're missing something in the picture that says, hey, if you're interested in doing this, but you're not going to be part of the C3 or the CPC, where do you fit into the picture?
So we have plenty of programs in the Node side of things that are administered by the ComCom or by the TSC, where to participate in it, you don't not need to be a member of the top level committee. And I think we need to differentiate between the types of programs that these bodies are running and how those operate. Keep that entirely separate from representation of the bodies itself. It's an administrative group.
That's sort of where I'm coming from, and looking at the picture, it's easy to forget about those other pieces because we don't have a box for any of them.
Yeah, so I think the box would be potentially, it gets a little, in my mind, the Commons.js would have been like this catch-all box for like if something emerges from like a separate project emerges from one of these top level committees that's large enough to be considered an initiative. It could be classified under there as resources that could go off to projects that are often to be represented by the foundation. But yeah, it's not really well captured where these kind of spin-off initiatives administered by these groups would go, who they're serving. Do these groups have a mandate only to serve top-level projects, or is their mandate to help provide resources to everybody in Sandbox and Incubator as well? So those definitions will be needed. And I think as we start coming up with, like, we're approaching this from trying to define what the top-level groups are before we define requirements. And I think we should instead define requirements of what we'd like to see the foundation offer and figure out how those are split between our current idea of top-level groups. And if one seems to not be fleshed out enough to warrant its existence, then we can have that conversation when we get there.
I think to add to what Adam was saying, I think that we may find that as things progress, we need more groups or less groups. And I think mostly what I was pushing at was what defines the differences between the two and what are their responsibilities. But we may find that, like, under something like the C3, there's a whole bunch of different initiatives within the foundation, or alternatively, we may find a whole bunch of disconnected initiatives. But I think it would be good to kind of figure out, maybe from a high level, as Adam was saying, what are the things that our foundation is going to provide and who will be responsible for those things. And in that, in the slide deck that Mike had put together, there was a space to define, like what responsibilities people have. But perhaps, and I don't know if we already have an issue open about this, we could maybe do an issue to talk about, like, at a high level, like, what is the foundation, what is the value that the foundation's bringing, and what are we doing, and what is our goals? And maybe we've, gotten really far ahead of that, but I think those initial goals and values that we started talking about that we haven't solidified is maybe a good place to start.
Trying to dig up. So in the here we go. So I'm going to paste something in the chat over here. These should be pulled out into whatever issue is created. I just pasted the meeting notes from the very first meeting where I had PR'd in a list of programs that were up on that wall and a whole bunch of sticky notes that were ideas for what we'd like to see the foundation provide to member projects. Presumably these may or may not be available to projects that are at any given level, sandbox versus incubator versus top level. But each one of these was an idea for something that the foundation could provide to members. That each one of these will probably have to get fleshed out enough that we can stick it under some top level committee and say this group is responsible for administering it. So we have some of this content created already. I think it just needs to be synthesized and exposed in a way that we're all thinking about it actively.
But I think it's worth looping, as we go through that, it's worth keeping in mind, within Node, there's a clear, there's kind of a clear separation between the two groups. I'm just as Miles was pointing it out, I'm just not sure once we go through these, it'll be as clear that we need two groups, or whether, people can, with different skills, can all be together in one group in the foundation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree that's something to explore. I mean, it's very possible that at this high enough of a level where you're focused on, like, almost everything's gonna be focused on governance, it's possible one group will suffice. However, if we're looking at actually providing services for programs, like actually providing a CI system that folks can opt into if they're part of the foundation, or if we're getting nitty-gritty technical like that, then we might still have a warrant to split these groups up. So I think as we flesh out programs, we'll start to see that divide.
Yeah, and the thing is, we're not going to have as many. The projects actually have lots of collaborators. I don't think we're going to have as many pure foundation collaborators in that sense, right? So, like doing things like CI, I guess it would probably be relying more on the foundation resources for those kinds of things, I would guess.
Mm-hmm.
I propose we just go ahead.
I was just going to say, at that top level structure, though, I mean, it needs to be explored to see whether it would be beneficial to create two whole separate entities or not. Because, maybe a subgroup of a top level entity that has both representatives of a technical side and the community side could easily, break into a subgroup to implement something like CI. I'm not convinced that they need to be two wholly separate things if their concerns really do overlap a lot on a top level.
So
yeah,
with that, we have 2 minutes left in the meeting. Just as a heads up, whomever I interrupted, please continue. But just a heads up, we got to end very soon.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say, sorry.
No, I was gonna say it's not a problem with me. Keep going on.
I propose that we flesh out what each the CPC and the C3 would look like, and then see how they overlap and see if it makes sense to merge them, but kind of get their scope a little more defined and go from there.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Do we have an issue for each one of those? I know we have like board representation issues, but we should just have an issue for each one of those, specifically what's the scope?
There's not an issue for the scope, just representation.
I think, Jory, wouldn't that feed into, if you were going to have a draft of the governance, wouldn't that actually cover some of that?
Not quite. My focus was really going to be on like the staging process, definition of like what a borrowing from the CNCF, what is this air quotes sandbox, air quotes incubating, air quotes graduate stage mean, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So I wasn't planning to get into that.
If I can suggest one thing we could maybe do, if we use GitHub projects, we can convert each one of those potential programs into a line item, and we could make vertical buckets for each of the committees, and just start kind of assigning things and just seeing how it shakes out.
Mm-hmm.
I would also recommend for the C3 and the CPC representation issues, Tierney, that we may want to just pull that back to defining each before we hop to the representation. I think the representation is part of that discussion.
Yeah, what we want each one to do will determine how we choose representation.
Just that we don't have more issues floating around such a similar thing.
Do we want to?
I'm sorry to interrupt everyone, but I actually have to drop and get onto another call. Can we kick this off into an issue?
Sure.
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Sorry for the abrupt ending. Until next week, 9 a.m. Eastern time, expect an issue open between Friday and Monday. Okay, bye everyone.
Thanks, Miles.
Talk to everybody
Bye.
later.
Thank
Bye.
you.